The alarm started before the light did. I was halfway through my third cup of dark tea when the console in front of me screamed. Not a polite tone, not the soft chime we used for routine traffic. This was the deep, grinding alert reserved for one thing only: an unidentified vessel crossing into monitored space without clearance. My name is Salen Korvath. I was a communications officer for the Ostari Concorde, stationed on a listening post at the edge of the Veyron expanse, a stretch of space so quiet that most officers posted here spent their days counting stars and waiting for retirement. Nothing happened at Veyron. That was the point of Veyron. It was supposed to be boring. I set down my cup so fast it spilled across the console, and I didn't even care. My eyes were locked on the screen, watching a single bright dot crawl across the edge of our sensor net, moving in from a direction nothing was supposed to come from. "Confirm contact," I said, my voice tighter than I wanted it to be. The system answered in its flat, emotionless tone. "Contact confirmed. Single vessel. Origin. Restricted sector. Classification. Unknown." Restricted sector. There was only one restricted sector close enough to reach us this fast, and every officer on this station knew exactly what lay behind it. We didn't talk about it much. We weren't supposed to. But everyone who had served more than a year out here had heard the old stories, passed down in hushed voices during long shifts, about the species we kept locked behind a wall of dense gas and old treaties. Humans. I felt my hands go cold even before I fully understood why. It wasn't fear of a fight. Veyron Outpost had weapons, shields, a full garrison. It was something else, something older and harder to explain, a kind of unease that lived in the back of every species' mind whenever that word came up in conversation. I keyed the comm to my superior's office without waiting for permission. "Commander Ithran, we have a contact crossing the boundary of the Threlic Veil. It's coming from the restricted zone." There was a pause on the other end, just long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. Then her voice came through, low and careful. "Are you certain?" "The system is certain. I'm just relaying it." Another pause. "I'm coming to the bridge." I sat there for a moment, watching that single dot continue its slow crawl across my screen, and I tried to remember everything I had ever learned about humans, because in that moment, I realized how little that actually was. We had first found them centuries ago, by Concorde reckoning, a noisy little species broadcasting signals into the dark from a single world tucked behind a thick band of stellar dust. At first, the galaxy had been curious. A new species meant new trade routes, new ideas, new voices to add to the great chorus of civilizations spread across the stars. Scouts were sent, diplomats followed, and then, very quickly, they stopped being sent. I had read the official reports once, during a slow week with nothing better to do. They were strange documents, full of careful language and gaps where information should have been. Words like unanticipated escalation and disproportionate response appeared again and again, but never any real explanation of what those words actually meant. What I did understand, reading between the lines, was that the first real encounters between humanity and the wider galaxy had not gone the way anyone expected. Something had happened. Something bad enough that within a single generation, an entire council of galactic powers had come together and agreed, unanimously, to seal humanity behind a dense nebula they called the Threlic Veil, a quarantine. Not because humans were too weak to be part of galactic society, but because, according to the whispers I'd heard from older officers, they were the opposite of weak, in ways nobody wanted to test again. After that, the silence had settled in. No human ship crossed the veil. No human voice answered any hail. For generations, humanity simply became a story we told young officers to keep them sharp. The monster under the bed of the galaxy, the species everyone agreed to forget about as long as it stayed forgotten in return. Until tonight. The door behind me slid open, and Commander Ithran walked in fast, her long coat still half-fastened, her eyes already fixed on the main display. She was an older officer, the kind who had seen enough strange things in her career that very little surprised her anymore. Tonight, she looked surprised. "Show me," she said. I pulled up the trajectory. The dot had a thin line trailing behind it now, plotting its path with cold precision. It wasn't wandering. It wasn't drifting. It was moving with clear purpose, in a straight line, directly toward the edge of the Corvan Dominion's contested border, a stretch of space my own people had been quietly arguing over with our rivals for the better part of a decade. "It's not heading toward us," I said. "It's heading toward the Aldra system." Ithran's jaw tightened. The Aldra system was a small cluster of habitable worlds caught between Ostari and Corvan territory, claimed by both sides, settled by neither, because doing so risked open conflict. It was the kind of place where a single spark could start something much larger. "Get me a clean channel," Ithran said. "I want to hail that ship before it gets any closer." I worked fast, my fingers moving across the console with practiced ease, even as my mind raced through everything I didn't know. We didn't have a translation protocol for human languages. We didn't have updated diplomatic codes. We had nothing current at all, because nobody had bothered to maintain contact procedures for a species that wasn't supposed to leave its cage. "Channel open," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ithran leaned toward the comm. "Unidentified vessel. This is Ostari listening post-Veyron. You are entering monitored space without clearance. Please respond and state your intentions." Silence answered us. Not the dead silence of an empty channel, but the strange, busy silence of something actively transmitting on a frequency we weren't tuned to. I adjusted the receiver, widening the scan, and that was when I heard it for the first time. A voice. Calm, steady, almost bored, speaking words I didn't understand, repeating the same short phrase over and over, on a frequency reserved across the entire galaxy, for one single purpose. Distress. "They're not answering us," I said slowly. "They're broadcasting an emergency signal, on the universal channel." Ithran frowned, stepping closer to the display, as if proximity might somehow make the situation clearer. "That's not a diplomatic frequency. That's not even a tactical one." "I know," I said. "It's the rescue channel, the one nobody touches except in genuine crisis." My stomach tightened as the pieces started fitting together in a way I didn't like. "Commander, I don't think this ship came here to talk to us at all." "Then why is it here?" I stared at the screen, at that small, bright dot, moving steadily toward a border two empires had spent a decade tiptoeing around, broadcasting a message meant only for someone in trouble. "I think," I said quietly, "someone called for help." And someone answered. Ithran didn't respond right away. She just stood there, watching the dot move closer to the Aldra system, closer to the Corvan patrol ships stationed along that border, closer to a moment neither of us could yet name, but both of us could feel coming, heavy and certain, like the air before a storm. "Get the fleet liaison on the line," she finally said, "and pull every file we have on humanity, even the old ones, even the ones marked irrelevant. I want everything we know about that species on my desk in 10 minutes. "That won't take long," I admitted. "We barely know anything." Ithran turned to look at me then, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw something close to genuine worry behind her composed expression. "That," she said, "is exactly what worries me." I turned back to the console, my hands steady out of habit, even as my thoughts spun in circles. Somewhere out there, beyond a wall of dust and decades of careful silence, a single ship had decided the rules didn't apply to it, and it was flying straight toward the one place in the galaxy where two armed and watchful powers were already standing far too close to the edge. I didn't know yet what that ship intended to do. I didn't know who, or what, it was answering that distress call for. All I knew, watching that small light cross my screen, was that the quiet, boring posting I had served at for 3 uneventful years had just ended, and whatever came next was not going to be quiet at all. The dot reached the edge of the Aldra system, and on every monitor across the outpost, alarms that had been silent for decades began, all at once, to wake up. The Aldra system held its breath, and so did I. Commander Ithran ordered a full sensor lock the moment the human vessel crossed into contested space, and within minutes, our entire outpost had shifted from a quiet listening post into something closer to a war room. Officers who had spent years filing routine reports were suddenly running diagnostics they hadn't touched since training. I stayed at my console, eyes fixed on the feed, watching that single ship grow larger and more detailed with every passing second. It did not look like anything in our records. Most warships I had ever seen, whether Ostari, Corvin, or any of the dozen smaller powers scattered across this part of the galaxy, followed a similar logic. Sleek hulls, balanced weapon arrays, designs built as much for appearance and intimidation as for function, because a warship was also a statement, a piece of propaganda meant to be photographed and feared. This ship looked nothing like that. Its hull was uneven, patched in places with metal that clearly didn't match the original plating. Sensor arrays jutted out at odd angles, as if they had been added later, bolted on wherever there was room, rather than where elegance demanded. Long scars ran along one side of the hull, old damage that had never been fully repaired, just sealed enough to keep flying. It looked less like a warship and more like a machine that had been through every kind of trouble imaginable and simply refused to stop working. Designation, Ithrin said, not looking away from the display. Working on it, I replied, running the hull pattern through every database we had access to. The results came back slow, fragmented, mostly pulled from decades-old archives that had clearly not been updated since the quarantine began. Closest match is a human deep space rescue vessel. Registry tag reads, Lifeline. A rescue ship, Ithrin repeated, something like disbelief creeping into her voice. That is not a rescue ship. I understood her confusion. The vessel carried visible weapon housings along its spine, heavy enough to make any tactical officer nervous. Yet its hull markings, the shape of its cargo bays, even the layout of what looked like medical docking ports along its underside, all matched known rescue vessel configurations far more closely than anything built for open conflict. Maybe it's both, I said quietly. Maybe, to them, it doesn't need to choose. Before Ithrin could respond, a new alert flashed across the main display, sharp and urgent. 3 Corvin Dominion patrol ships had altered course, moving to intercept the human vessel at the edge of the Aldra cluster. My stomach tightened. The Corvin Dominion had never been a patient power. They considered Aldra theirs by right of proximity, and the unwritten agreement that kept the system neutral had always rested on a careful balance of threat and restraint between them and the Concord. A single unidentified ship entering their claimed space, broadcasting a frequency they likely didn't even recognize, was exactly the kind of excuse they had been waiting for. Get me eyes on the Corvin channel, Ithrin said. I switched frequencies, and harsh, clipped Corvin battle chatter filled the room, translated a half-second later by our system into clean, neutral Concord speech. Unknown vessel, you have entered Dominion sovereign space. Reduce speed and prepare to be boarded. No response came. The human ship continued on its course, unhurried, as if the warning had simply not registered as important. They're repeating it, I said as the Corvin channel crackled again, this time with a noticeably sharper edge. Unknown vessel, this is your final warning. Reduce speed immediately, or you will be fired upon. Still nothing. The human ship held its course, steady and unbothered, broadcasting that same simple distress signal over and over on its own frequency, completely indifferent to the increasingly tense demands being shouted at it from another channel entirely. They're not even listening to them, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's not defiance. It's like they genuinely don't realize anyone is talking to them. That's impossible, Ithrin said. No ship enters contested space without monitoring every channel available. Unless, I said slowly, the realization settling over me like cold water, they're not monitoring military channels at all. Unless that ship was never built to listen for warnings, only for people calling for help. Ithrin turned to look at me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke, because we both understood what that meant. This wasn't a warship probing enemy territory with careful calculation. This was a single vessel, possibly with a skeleton crew, sailing directly into one of the most dangerous flashpoints in this entire region of space, focused entirely on whatever distress call had pulled it out of the silence in the first place. It didn't know, or didn't care, that it had just walked into the middle of a standoff between 2 armed powers who had been looking for any reason to test each other's resolve. Commander, I said, should we attempt contact ourselves? If we can reach them before the Corvin do, maybe we can de-escalate this before it goes any further. Ithrin was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing options that all carried risk. Officially, the Concord had no authority to intervene in a Dominion border dispute. Unofficially, Every officer on this station understood that whatever happened in the next few minutes could reshape the political landscape of this entire region for years to come. "Open every channel we have," she finally said. "Try every protocol in our archive, even the obsolete ones. If there is any chance of reaching that ship before things go wrong, I want it taken." I worked quickly, layering frequency after frequency, broadcasting greetings in every dialect our translation systems carried, old diplomatic codes, modern hailing protocols, anything that might catch the attention of whoever was steering that strange, scarred vessel toward an entire fleet of hostile ships. For a long moment, nothing answered. Then, abruptly, a new voice came through, cutting cleanly across every channel I had open at once, as if it had simply chosen to respond on all of them simultaneously, rather than waste time figuring out which one mattered. "This is Captain Owen Marsh, Earth Vessel Lifeline. We are responding to a distress call originating from this system. Repeat, we are answering a distress call. We are not here for your border dispute, and we are not stopping." The voice was calm, almost conversational. It carried none of the formal weight I expected from a military communication, none of the careful diplomatic phrasing every other species used when crossing into contested territory. It sounded like a man simply stating facts, entirely unconcerned with how those facts might be received. Ithrin leaned toward the comm, choosing her words with visible care. "Captain Marsh, this is Commander Ithrin of the Ostari Concord. You are entering one of the most volatile regions in this sector. The Corvin Dominion has already issued multiple warnings. I strongly advise you alter course before this situation escalates." There was a brief pause before the human's voice returned, and when it did, there was something in his tone that I would spend a long time afterward trying to properly understand. Not anger, not fear. Something closer to weary patience, the voice of someone who had explained this exact thing far too many times before. "Commander, I appreciate the warning," he said, "but somewhere in this system, there are people who sent out a call because they are in serious trouble, and that call has priority over anything else happening here. If your Dominion friends want to make this difficult, that's on them, not me. They will fire on you," Ithrin said bluntly. "They can try," Marsh replied, and the line went quiet. I stared at the display, watching the human ship's trajectory remain completely unchanged, still moving steadily toward the heart of the Aldra cluster, still ignoring every warning shouted at it from the Corvin fleet, now closing in from 3 directions. "Commander," I said, "the Corvin ships are powering weapons." Ithrin's jaw tightened. "Hail them. Tell them to stand down, that this is a humanitarian situation, that escalating now serves no one." I tried. I broadcast every plea I could think of across the Dominion frequency, watched as our message registered, watched as it was, just as clearly, ignored. "They're not listening either," I said quietly. "Both sides have already decided what's about to happen." Ithrin stood very still, watching the same display I was. 3 Corvin warships closing in on a single, scarred, unarmored-looking vessel that, by every reasonable measure, had no business surviving what was coming. "Get the recorders running," she said finally, her voice low. "Every channel, every sensor, full archive. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, I want it documented in detail." "You think they're going to lose?" I said. Ithrin didn't answer right away. She kept her eyes fixed on the small, defiant dot, still cutting steadily through space, toward whatever distress signal had called it there, utterly unmoved by the gathering storm closing in around it. "I think," she said slowly, "that everyone in this system is about to learn something none of us are prepared for." I didn't fully understand what she meant, not yet. I only knew that my hands had gone cold again, the same way they had the moment that first alarm sounded, and that somewhere deep in the quiet part of my mind that still remembered old stories about a species we had locked away and tried hard to forget, a small, persistent voice was telling me that the Corvin Dominion had just made a very serious mistake. The 3 patrol ships closed their formation, weapons fully charged, broadcasting one final warning across every channel. The human ship did not slow down. It did not change course. It simply kept moving toward whoever had called for help, as if the gathering fleet ahead of it was little more than weather to fly through, and somewhere behind that calm, almost casual tone Captain Marsh had used only moments before, I began to understand that we were not watching a ship preparing to negotiate. We were watching a ship preparing to finish what it had come to do, regardless of what stood in its way. The first shot came from the Corvin side, and after that, everything happened faster than I could properly track. I had watched skirmishes before, mostly old recordings, used in training exercises, careful, almost theatrical exchanges between evenly matched fleets that followed predictable patterns of advance and retreat. What unfolded over the Aldra cluster that day followed no pattern I recognized at all. The lead Corvin cruiser opened fire first, a clean warning shot meant to cross the human vessel's bow and force a response. It never reached its target. The lifeline shifted course at the very last moment, a tight, almost violent turn that should have strained any vessel of its size past safe limits, and the shot sailed harmlessly into open space. "That maneuver shouldn't be possible," I heard one of the tactical officers mutter behind me. "Not at that mass, not at that speed." I didn't have time to agree with him before the second and third Corvin ships opened fire in earnest, no longer bothering with warning shots. Streaks of weapons fire lit up my display, converging on a single point in space where the human vessel had been only a moment before. It wasn't there anymore. I had to replay the sensor feed twice before I understood what I was looking at. The lifeline hadn't dodged in any conventional sense. It had simply refused to move in a straight, predictable line at any point, weaving through the Corvin formation with a kind of reckless, almost desperate momentum that defied every principle of efficient piloting I had ever studied. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't careful. It looked, more than anything, like a ship being flown by someone who had decided survival mattered far more than style. "They're taking damage," the tactical officer said, and he was right. Even with that erratic flight pattern, the human ship couldn't avoid everything. I watched as one of the Corvin volleys clipped its outer hull, sending a visible shudder through the vessel's frame, stripping away a section of plating that spun off into the dark. I expected the ship to slow down, to retreat, to call for backup, to do any of the things a rational commander would do when facing 3 armed warships alone and already wounded. Instead, it turned directly toward the nearest Corvin cruiser and closed the distance. "What is he doing?" Ithran said sharply, leaning forward. I didn't have an answer. None of the standard tactical doctrines I had ever studied called for closing distance against a numerically superior force. Every accepted strategy emphasized range, positioning, patience. The human ship seemed to be operating on an entirely different set of rules, ones that valued aggression and proximity over caution, as if putting distance between itself and danger had simply never occurred to whoever was flying it. The nearest Corvin cruiser tried to adjust, attempting to bring its full weapons array to bear on the rapidly closing human vessel, but the lifeline was already too close, cutting inside the cruiser's effective firing arc with a precision that contradicted everything about its earlier reckless flying. A series of smaller weapon emplacements along the human ship's hull, the ones I had assumed were defensive in nature, opened fire in tight, controlled bursts, striking the cruiser's engine section with what looked like surgical accuracy. The Corvin cruiser's engines flared, sputtered, and died. "They disabled it," I said, almost unable to believe what I was seeing. "They didn't destroy it. They disabled it." Ithran said nothing, her eyes fixed on the unfolding engagement with an intensity I had never seen from her before. The 2 remaining Corvin ships adjusted their formation, clearly recalculating, no longer treating the human vessel as an easy target to be swatted aside. They split apart, attempting to catch the lifeline in a crossfire from 2 directions at once, a sound tactical decision that should have forced any reasonable opponent into a difficult retreat. The human ship didn't retreat. It accelerated directly between them. For a brief, terrifying moment, I genuinely believed I was about to watch that small, scarred vessel torn apart between 2 converging fields of weapons fire, and some part of me, the part that had spent years quietly fearing the old stories about this species, almost expected exactly that, almost wanted to look away. I didn't look away. The lifeline's shields flared bright as it absorbed a brutal exchange of fire from both sides simultaneously, the entire hull visibly shuddering under the strain, alarms surely screaming through every corridor of that ship, in ways I could only imagine. And still it kept moving forward, threading the narrow gap between the 2 cruisers with a margin so thin it barely seemed possible, returning fire in both directions as it passed. When it cleared the gap, both Corvin cruisers were drifting, their engines dark, their weapons silent. The entire engagement, from the first warning shot to the final disabled cruiser, had lasted less than 4 minutes. The bridge around me had gone completely silent. Officers who moments earlier had been calling out tactical updates now simply stared at their displays, watching the human vessel slow its approach, its hull scarred and smoking in places, drifting past the 3 crippled Corvin ships, without a single further shot fired. "Status on the Corvin vessels," Ithrin finally said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "All 3 disabled," the tactical officer reported, his voice carrying a strange mixture of disbelief and something close to professional respect. "Engines and weapon systems offline across the board. Hull integrity intact on all 3. Crew compartments show no significant damage." "He didn't destroy them," I said again, mostly to myself. He could have. By any reasonable measure, he had every opportunity to finish all 3 ships, and he didn't. "Maybe that wasn't the goal," Ithrin said. I thought about Captain Marsh's voice from earlier, calm and almost bored, talking about a distress call that had priority over everything else happening in that system. I thought about the careful, almost surgical strikes against engines and weapons rather than crew compartments, the deliberate choice to disable rather than destroy 3 armed warships that had attacked first, and given him every justification to respond with far greater force. "It wasn't," I said slowly, understanding settling over me like a physical weight. He wasn't fighting to win a battle. He was fighting to clear a path. As if to confirm exactly that, the human vessel altered course one final time, moving past the drifting wreckage of the Corvin fleet and continuing deeper into the Aldra system, toward a small, unremarkable moon orbiting the cluster's 3rd planet, a moon that, according to our outdated records, hosted nothing more than an old mining outpost, long since stripped of any meaningful resources. "Pull up everything we have on that moon," Ithrin ordered. It took a few minutes for the data to come through, fragments of old survey reports and outdated registry information, but eventually, a picture began to form. The mining outpost wasn't entirely abandoned after all. A small, independent settlement had taken root there years ago. People from a dozen different species who had drifted to the edges of explored space looking for somewhere quiet to live, far from the politics of larger powers. It wasn't affiliated with the Concord. It wasn't affiliated with the Dominion. It barely registered on anyone's maps at all. "There's a notation here," I said, scanning the most recent entry in the file, dated only a few days earlier. "Automated distress beacon, triggered following what looks like a structural failure in the settlement's primary life support system. Population estimate, just under 200. The pieces finally clicked into place, all at once, with a clarity that left me feeling strangely hollow. "That's the call," I said. That's what he answered. A small, forgotten settlement of refugees and wanderers, tucked away on an unremarkable moon nobody else had bothered to check on, had sent out a single automated distress signal into the silence of deep space. And somewhere far beyond the Threlic Veil, on a world the rest of the galaxy had spent generations trying to forget, that signal had been heard, and answered, by a single ship willing to fly directly into the middle of an active border standoff, take fire from 3 armed warships, and disable an entire patrol fleet, without losing a single member of its own crew, all without ever slowing down or reconsidering its course. Ithrin stood very still, watching the human vessel approach the small moon, its damaged hull glowing faintly from the heat of battle, beginning what looked like preparations for an emergency docking sequence. "Get me a line to Dominion Command," she finally said, "before they decide to send a larger fleet to answer this." I moved to comply, my hands working the console out of habit, but my mind remained fixed on the image still glowing on the main display. A single, battered ship, sent not as a weapon of conquest or a show of force, but simply because somewhere, 200 frightened people had asked for help, and someone, somewhere, had decided that request mattered more than any border, any treaty, any standoff between empires. I thought again of the old stories, the careful, fearful language in those ancient reports, the unanimous decision to seal an entire species behind a wall of dust and silence. For the first time, I began to understand, with a chill that settled deep into my bones, that perhaps the galaxy had never feared humanity because of what they might do in conquest. Perhaps it feared them because of exactly what I had just witnessed, a single, ordinary rescue mission, carried out with a level of relentless, uncompromising determination that no other species in this entire region of space would have dared to attempt. And somewhere beneath that fear, quiet and unwelcome, I felt the first stirrings of something else entirely. I felt, despite everything, something close to awe. 3 days later, I found myself sitting in a shuttle that smelled faintly of recycled air and old metal, approaching the lifeline as it sat in a careful holding orbit above the small settlement moon, and I had never in my entire career felt less prepared for an assignment. The order had come directly from Concord Regional Command, bypassing several layers of bureaucracy that normally would have taken weeks to navigate. In the aftermath of the engagement, with 3 Dominion warships disabled and a tense standoff narrowly avoided through hours of careful diplomatic maneuvering between Ithran and her Corvan counterparts, someone in a much higher position than either of us had decided that official contact needed to be made with the human vessel before rumors and half-truths shaped the narrative for them. I had been chosen, according to the brief explanation I received, because I had handled the initial communications during the engagement, and because, in the strange logic of bureaucracy, the people who make these decisions often prefer to send someone who has already survived the first encounter, rather than risk training someone new. I did not feel particularly reassured by that logic. The shuttle's docking sequence completed with a gentle clunk, and the airlock cycled open onto a corridor that told me almost everything about this ship before a single crew member appeared. The walls were scarred in places, patched with mismatched plating that had clearly been salvaged and reapplied under pressure, rather than carefully selected to match the original design. Cables ran along sections of the ceiling that, on most vessels I had served aboard, would have been neatly concealed behind smooth paneling. It was not a ship built for appearances. It was a ship built to keep working, no matter what condition it was in. A woman was waiting for me at the end of the corridor, dressed in a simple, practical uniform with grease stains along one sleeve that she had clearly not bothered to clean before greeting a visiting official. She introduced herself as Laura Bennett, the ship's senior pilot, and the same easy, almost casual confidence I had heard in Captain Marsh's voice during our first exchange was present in hers as well. "You're the one who kept hailing us during the fight," she said, studying me with open curiosity, rather than suspicion. "Sailing, right? Good reflexes. Most outposts out here freeze up the first time something unexpected happens." "I had a great deal of motivation," I admitted. She laughed, a short, genuine sound that caught me off guard. "Fair enough. Come on, the captain's waiting in the galley. We don't really do formal meeting rooms on this ship. Never had the budget for one." I followed her through the ship, noting details as we walked, the way crew members moved past each other with quick, easy familiarity, the way damage reports were posted on a simple board near what appeared to be a communal eating area rather than buried in some official channel, the relaxed, almost casual atmosphere that felt entirely at odds with what I had witnessed only days earlier. Captain Owen Marsh was younger than I had expected, seated at a worn metal table with a cup of something steaming in front of him, a thin bandage visible along one forearm where, I assumed, he had picked up an injury sometime during the engagement or its aftermath. He looked up as I entered and gestured for me to sit, his expression carrying none of the formal weight I had braced myself for. "Officer Corvath," he said, "appreciate you coming out. I know this whole situation has probably caused your people more headaches than you needed." "That would be an understatement," I said, taking the offered seat. "Captain, I have been sent to formally establish contact on behalf of the Ostari Concord, and to better understand the circumstances of your arrival in this system." "Sure," he said simply. "Ask away." I had prepared a long list of careful, diplomatically worded questions during the shuttle ride over, questions designed to extract information without causing offense, without triggering whatever unknown response might follow from a species the galaxy had spent generations fearing. Sitting across from him now, in this small, worn galley, with the faint smell of recycled coffee in the air, those careful questions suddenly felt almost absurd. "I'll be direct," I said instead. "We watched your ship disable 3 armed Dominion warships in under 4 minutes, after taking fire first, without losing a single crew member. and without significant damage to your hull integrity. Our records on your species are decades out of date and largely speculative. I would like to understand what exactly we witnessed." Marsh considered the question for a moment, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "Honestly," he said, "it wasn't anything special. We're a rescue vessel. We don't go looking for fights. But when 3 ships open fire on us unprovoked while we're trying to reach people who sent out a distress call, we don't really have the option of just letting that happen." "Your crew complement," I said. "How many people are aboard this vessel?" 14, he said. I stared at him. 14 people disabled an entire patrol fleet. 14 people, and a very stubborn ship, Bennett added from where she leaned against the doorway, a faint smile on her face that suggested she found my reaction more amusing than alarming. "Lifeline's seen worse than 3 Corvin cruisers. Trust me." "Worse," I repeated. Marsh shrugged, a gesture so casual it took me a moment to fully register the weight of what he was actually saying. "We're a rescue ship," he said again, as if that simple fact explained everything I needed to know. "We get sent into situations other people have already given up on. Sometimes that means weather. Sometimes it means hostile territory. Sometimes it means folks who'd rather shoot first than let us reach the people we're actually there for. You adapt." I sat with that for a long moment, trying to reconcile the calm, almost mundane way he spoke about the engagement with everything I had witnessed from my console 3 days earlier. This had not been an elite military strike force. This had not been a specially selected vessel sent to make some kind of political statement. This had been, by every account I was now hearing, an ordinary rescue mission, undertaken by an ordinary crew, doing exactly what they had been trained and equipped to do. "May I ask," I said carefully, "why your ship did not attempt to make contact through standard diplomatic channels before entering contested space? Our outpost broadcast multiple hailing protocols. The Dominion issued repeated warnings. Your vessel did not respond to any of them." For the first time since I had sat down, something shifted in Marsh's expression, a flicker of genuine consideration, rather than easy confidence. "That's actually a fair question," he said, "and the honest answer is that we weren't equipped for it. We left in a hurry. Standard procedure when a distress beacon comes through is to scramble the nearest available vessel as fast as possible, especially when the population estimate includes children. We didn't have time to coordinate diplomatic clearance with 2 different governments we'd never had contact with before. We had a beacon, a population count, and a clock running on a failing life support system. Everything else became secondary. You understood," I said slowly, "that crossing into contested territory without clearance carried significant risk." "We understood," he confirmed. "We also understood that 200 people on a moon nobody else seemed to be checking on had maybe a day left before their life support gave out entirely. When you put those 2 things on a scale, the choice wasn't difficult." I thought about the careful, almost surgical way his ship had disabled rather than destroyed 3 armed warships that had fired first and given him every reasonable justification to respond with overwhelming force. "Your restraint during the engagement," I said. "Disabling the Dominion vessels rather than destroying them. Was that a calculated political decision?" Marsh shook his head. "No politics involved. Those crews didn't do anything except follow orders from people who decided to test an unfamiliar ship in contested space. That's not really their fault. Disabling them got them out of our way, without anyone needing to die over a border dispute that had nothing to do with the people we were actually trying to reach." The simplicity of his answer unsettled me more than any elaborate strategic justification could have. There was no hidden calculation, no careful political messaging behind the choice. It had simply been, in his mind, the obvious and correct decision, made in the middle of active combat, without hesitation. "Captain," I said, choosing my next words with care, "my people have maintained a quarantine around your species for generations, based on incidents from your first contact with the wider galaxy, that I genuinely do not have full details on. I have spent the last 3 days trying to understand what kind of threat that quarantine was meant to contain. After witnessing your ship in action, and now speaking with you directly, I find myself more confused than when I started." Marsh leaned back slightly, a faint, almost tired smile crossing his face. "I figured someone would eventually ask that," he said. "Look, I wasn't there for whatever happened back then. None of my crew were even born yet. But from what gets passed down, It wasn't really about us being aggressive, not exactly. It was more that everyone who met us early on expected us to behave a certain way, and we just didn't. We didn't follow the unwritten rules nobody bothered explaining to us. We didn't back down the way people expected. We didn't stop when stopping seemed like the reasonable thing to do. And somewhere along the way, that got read as something far more frightening than it actually was. And what was it, in your view? I asked. He considered the question for a long moment, glancing toward Bennett, who offered only a small shrug in response, as if this were a conversation they had clearly had before, among themselves, without ever fully resolving it. Stubbornness, mostly, Marsh finally said. We don't quit easily. Doesn't matter if it's a fight, a rescue, an argument, a bad situation with no clean way out. Once we commit to something, stopping halfway just isn't really part of how we're built. I think that scared people more than actual aggression would have. Aggression has limits. Stubbornness doesn't always. I sat with that explanation for a long moment, turning it over carefully, comparing it against everything I had witnessed over the past 3 days. A single ship, crewed by 14 people, sailing directly into contested space because somewhere a beacon had gone off, ignoring every warning shouted at it, taking damage without slowing down, disabling an entire fleet with careful, deliberate restraint, and now sitting here explaining all of it with the same casual tone someone might use to describe an unremarkable workday. This mission, I said slowly, from your perspective, was this considered an unusual or extraordinary event? Bennett actually laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that echoed slightly in the small galley. Marsh allowed himself a faint smile as well, shaking his head. Honestly, he said, no. This was Tuesday. I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood some element of translation. I'm sorry? It's an expression, Bennett explained, still smiling. Means an ordinary day. Nothing special. We've had worse calls than this one. This was just Tuesday. I sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of that statement settling over me slowly, thoroughly, until it occupied every corner of my thoughts. An entire galaxy had spent generations fearing this species, sealing them behind a wall of dust and treaties, whispering careful warnings to young officers about a danger too great to risk encountering again. And the event that had just thrown 2 empires into a tense, nearly catastrophic standoff, the event that had disabled an entire patrol fleet and forced regional command to send a diplomatic officer scrambling to make sense of what had happened, was, to the people who had actually carried it out, nothing more than an unremarkable Tuesday. Captain Marsh, I said carefully, I believe my superiors are going to have a great many more questions for you. They usually do, he said, finishing the last of whatever was in his cup. We're happy to answer what we can. But Officer Korvath, I'd ask you to pass one thing along to your command, if you don't mind. Of course, I said. We're not interested in starting trouble, he said, his easy tone shifting into something more direct, more sincere. We didn't come back into the wider galaxy looking for a fight. We came because someone needed help, and we intend to keep answering calls like that whenever they come in, regardless of what borders happen to be in the way. If that makes people nervous, I understand. But it's not going to change what we do. I left the lifeline a short while later, carrying with me a recording of that entire conversation, a recording I knew would be studied carefully by analysts and officials across the entire Concord in the days to come. As my shuttle pulled away from the ship's hull, I found myself looking back at it one final time, that scarred, patched, thoroughly unglamorous vessel that had, in less than a week, completely upended generations of careful assumption. I thought again of that simple word Bennett had used, so casually, to describe everything I had witnessed. Tuesday, an ordinary day, nothing special. And somewhere in the back of my mind, that old familiar unease returned, quieter now but somehow far more unsettling than before, because I understood, with growing certainty, that this single rescue ship, with its 14 crew members and its mismatched hull plating, had not been sent because it was humanity's strongest, most capable vessel. It had been sent because it happened to be the nearest one available, and if this was simply an ordinary day for them, I found myself wondering, with a chill that settled deep into my chest, what an extraordinary one might actually look like. The recording spread faster than any official channel could control. Within a week of my return to Veyron Outpost, the conversation I had shared with Captain Marsh in that small, worn galley had been transcribed, translated, and distributed through every level of Concord Command, then leaked, as these things inevitably do, to channels far beyond official oversight. By the time a full month had passed, it felt as though every major news network across this entire region of the galaxy had analyzed that single word, Tuesday, from every conceivable angle. I had not expected to become a minor point of interest in the process, but officers who had merely relayed communications during a tense military standoff rarely found themselves invited to speak before regional councils. I did, 3 times, each session more uncomfortable than the last, as senior officials who had never once set foot near the Threlic Vale pressed me for details about a species they suddenly, urgently, needed to understand. Did the captain express any territorial ambitions? One counselor asked during my second hearing, her expression carefully neutral in the way senior diplomats are trained to maintain. None, I answered honestly. His only stated concern was reaching the people who had sent the distress call. And you believe that was the full and complete truth of his intentions? I thought about the easy, unguarded way Marsh and Bennett had spoken to me, the casual confidence that carried no trace of careful political calculation, the genuine surprise in their voices when I had asked whether the engagement was considered extraordinary by their standards. I believe, I said carefully, that they were not performing for an audience. I do not think they considered our conversation significant enough to require careful messaging. That, counselor, is precisely what concerns me most. The room had gone quiet at that, and I understood, watching the careful, troubled expressions around that table, that I was not the only one beginning to grasp the full weight of what had happened in the Aldra system. The Corvan Dominion, for their part, moved with unusual speed and unusual quiet. Within 2 weeks of the engagement, official reports confirmed that all Dominion patrol vessels had been withdrawn from the entire region surrounding the Threlic Vale, redirected to territories considerably further from human-adjacent space. No formal announcement accompanied the withdrawal. No diplomatic statement explained the sudden change in posture. The Dominion simply pulled back, quietly and thoroughly, leaving the contested border around Aldra entirely uncontested for the first time in over a decade. I learned later, through channels I was not technically supposed to have access to, that the 3 Corvan captains whose ships had been disabled during the engagement had each independently filed reports describing the same unsettling detail. None of them had ever identified the moment their weapon systems failed. One moment they were exchanging fire with a smaller, outmatched vessel. The next, their engines were dark and their ship was drifting, and not one of them could fully reconstruct how that transition had occurred. The human ship's tactics had moved faster, and with more precision, than their own sensors could properly track in real time. That detail, more than anything else, seemed to unsettle the wider galactic community. A species capable of overwhelming force was frightening, in a familiar, understandable way. A species capable of disabling 3 armed warships with such precise control that the targeted crews themselves could not clearly explain what had happened to them was something else entirely. Something far harder to plan around, far harder to deter. Within the Concord itself, the debate that followed consumed every level of government for months. I sat through countless sessions, formal and informal, where officials argued bitterly over what this single incident truly meant. Some insisted the quarantine had been entirely justified, that the Aldra engagement proved exactly why humanity needed to remain sealed behind the veil, a danger too unpredictable and too capable to risk integrating into wider galactic society. Others argued the opposite, that a species willing to risk armed conflict purely to rescue 200 unaffiliated refugees, and willing to show such deliberate restraint even while doing so, represented an extraordinary potential ally, rather than a threat to be feared. I found myself, more often than I expected, defending neither position fully. I do not believe they are simply dangerous, I told one particularly heated council session, several months after my conversation aboard the Lifeline, and I do not believe they are simply benevolent. I believe they are something the rest of us have never properly learned to categorize, because every framework we use to evaluate other species assumes a kind of caution, a kind of self-preservation instinct that does not appear to function the same way for them. They do not calculate risk the way we do. They calculate need, and then they act, regardless of what that risk actually is. That sounds remarkably dangerous, Officer Korvath, one counselor said sharply. It is, I agreed. It is also, apparently, why 200 refugees on a forgotten moon are alive today, instead of dead from a life support failure no one else in this entire region of space had noticed or responded to. The council had no immediate answer for that, and I noted, watching their careful, troubled expressions, that very few of them did across the months that followed. The settlement on that small moon, I learned later, had been fully evacuated and resettled, with the Lifeline's crew personally overseeing the transfer of all 200 residents to a stable habitat further within human-monitored space, an offer the settlement's elected representatives had apparently accepted without significant hesitation, despite generations of galactic suspicion, toward the very species now offering them shelter. I found that detail more telling than almost anything else that emerged from the incident. People who had lived their entire lives outside any major government's protection, who had no particular reason to trust anyone, had looked at the evidence directly in front of them and made their own judgment, separate from generations of careful, fearful rumor. Word of the engagement spread well beyond Concord and Dominion space within the following year, carried along trade routes and diplomatic channels until it reached governments far removed from the Threlic Veil, civilizations that had perhaps only ever heard the vaguest, second-hand rumors about humanity's existence. I followed the resulting shifts in galactic politics with a kind of detached fascination that gradually, over time, became something closer to genuine unease. Several smaller, independent powers, species too small to maintain significant military forces of their own, began quietly establishing contact protocols aimed at the edges of human space, hoping, I suspected, to position themselves favorably should humanity ever choose to expand its presence more broadly across the galaxy. Larger, more established empires responded with considerably more caution, reinforcing border defenses near the Veil, commissioning new analysis on human tactical doctrine, quietly preparing for a future none of them could confidently predict. I returned to Veyron Outpost a changed officer, though it took me considerable time to fully understand exactly how. I no longer thought of humanity as the distant, half-mythical danger I had grown up hearing whispered about in hushed conversations between older officers. I thought of Captain Marsh, calm and unhurried, explaining a near-catastrophic military engagement with the same casual tone someone might use to describe an unremarkable supply run. I thought of Bennett's easy laughter, of the worn, patched hull of a ship that had clearly survived far worse than 3 Dominion cruisers, and simply kept flying regardless. I thought of that single word, repeated again and again across every analysis and council session I sat through over the following year, a word that had somehow become, for an entire region of the galaxy, a quiet, persistent source of dread. Tuesday. An ordinary day, nothing special by their own account. And if that was true, if a single, lightly crewed rescue vessel disabling an entire patrol fleet without losing a crew member truly represented nothing more than routine business for this species, then the question that kept every council chamber and every command bridge across this region of space awake at night was not whether humanity posed a danger to the wider galaxy. It was what, exactly, an extraordinary day might look like, and whether any of us, after generations spent carefully forgetting they existed at all, were prepared to find out. I think often, even now, about the moment that single bright dot first crossed onto my sensor display, breaking decades of careful silence along the edge of the Threlic Veil. I think about how certain I was, in that first instant, that I was witnessing the beginning of some terrible conflict, some long-feared invasion finally arriving after generations of uneasy peace. I was wrong about that, in the end. There was no invasion, there was no conquest, no grand declaration of intent, no sweeping campaign to reclaim territory or assert dominance over species who had spent generations trying to forget humanity ever existed. There was only a single ship, answering a single distress call, doing exactly what it had been built and crewed to do, regardless of the empires standing in its way. And perhaps that, more than anything else, is the truth the rest of the galaxy now has to quietly sit with. We did not fear humanity because they sought to conquer us. We feared them because, when finally given the chance to act on their own terms again after so long behind that wall of dust and silence, the very first thing they chose to do was save people none of the rest of us had even bothered to notice were in danger at all. If that was simply an ordinary Tuesday for them, then somewhere out there, beyond a border the galaxy had spent generations pretending did not need watching, an entire species capable of so much more was waiting, quietly, patiently, for the next call to come in. And for the first time since I had joined the Concord, I found myself genuinely uncertain whether that thought should frighten me, or whether, despite everything I had been taught to believe, it should give me hope instead. Perhaps, I have come to think, it was always meant to be both.